So welcome again to Consumption Conversations. And with us today, we have Ashley Colby, who has lived for many years in Uruguay before she came recently back to the United States. And I'm particularly going to ask her about her knowledge, experience of lifestyles in Uruguay. So Ashley, could you introduce yourself for a few sentences and say, why are you concerned about sustainable lifestyles?
Sure. So hi, I'm Ashley Colby. I am an environmental sociologist. I was trained at Washington State University. And my interests have always been in sustainable food systems. Excuse me. Specifically, um, I was looking for my dissertation at people who self-produce food for their own consumption in the United States, in Chicago, actually. And that took me on a whole long journey, including wanting to teach in the field, experiential learning. And so I went with my family, my husband, my two young daughters. Now I have three, to Uruguay in South America, where we opened this field school. We brought students from the United States to see agroecological farms. And I'm interested in sustainable lifestyles for many different reasons, not only, for the planet, the environment, ecology, but also quality of life, sort of meaning, connection to nature. I found a lot of really interesting data in my dissertation research about the way in which gardening foments this kind of beautiful symbiotic relationship between humans and the planet that's really meaningful for people. So for all of those reasons, I'm interested.
Okay, so taking you back to Uruguay, can you give us some idea of what the lifestyle is like in Uruguay that's relevant to issues of sustainable lifestyles, and whether it has something that we could learn from? For example, it's got a relatively high education and relatively high income level in comparison to some other South American countries. But is its consumption in some way different? If you look at some of the characteristics of Uruguay, it is progressive, and on the other hand, maybe it's also retaining something of traditional lifestyles.
Yeah, it has a really, really great mix. And so, to paint a picture a little bit, I think they have quite a bit of sort of left-leaning, state-centered sort of initiatives. We want everybody to be literate. We want everybody to have access to the internet. The sort of progressive, using the mechanism of the state to make sure that everybody has a basic standard of education and living. But then on the other hand, there's just quite a strong traditional culture, and it's really a land-based culture. There's not a similar, I would draw a parallel for people who know it better to New Zealand. It's like there's not as many people as there is land. There's like more animals than people with cattle and sheep. And it's just a really deeply land-based culture. Of course, a lot of the people live in Montevideo too, but a lot of them have, connections to the land and to small towns. So I'm going to I can talk in more detail about sort of what our life was like there and what it was like to bring students there. But broadly, I would say they've done a really good job of sort of um, not developing to the point that everyone's lost their connection to their land base, to the point that everything is technological, everything is urban, but instead they've got this nice mix where they have development, state-based and lots of state-based, but other development that provides a really nice quality of life. Really progressive values, good access to education, good access to healthcare, while also retaining a sort of, sort of somewhat traditional livelihood. And we can talk a little bit about different ways in which I saw that happening. But one thing that comes to mind is, for example, energy is very expensive there, let's say relative to the United States. So what do people do if electricity is very expensive and gas is very expensive? They make do, they consume less, they get smaller cars, they ride around on scooters, they take bikes. Some people in my area rode on horseback, brought their kids to school on horseback. Very common to see, which is, you know, kind of out of the realm of possibility for most of us in, you know, the developed world, Europe and North America. And there's just different ways in which those kinds of, I guess, historical material factors like the cost of energy make for a different cultural way of being. So people make do, people recycle, people share, people aren't buying everything brand new. I mean, people share resources, they share tools, they come over and help each other. You know, it's like everybody, there's like a friend who owns a concrete mixer if you're going to do something, and you'll have your friend come over and bring their tool over. Not everybody owns everything. So it's like not a hyper consumerist environment because things are expensive and people have less money to spend. So, you know, this culture kind of grows out of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's is that encouraged and promoted by the government at the state level, or is it something in the way of life and culture of and the norms of society in Uruguay?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm trying to think like in a if zoomed out historical materialist perspective, I think that in the highly developed world, we have just a lot of privilege and access to cheap goods, and the culture has sort of grown out of that. But for most of the world, the rest of the world, and for most of human history, the culture of sort of making do with less total wealth, less total consumption was just like the way of life for most people. And I would think about things like financial crises in Uruguay and Argentina and the ways in which, you know, there's sort of rampant inflation and you can't really access things. And what happens out of those moments of crisis is a kind of interdependence and solidarity between people because people have to make do. They have to find ways to get bread, you know, they have to find ways to eat. And so that kind of culture where, you know, the machinations of global empires impacts these regular people, and then people find ways to make do in crisis. They've gone through several rounds of these kinds of crises, Uruguay less so than Argentina. But you know, so in all of Latin America, these sort of rounds of crises, economic crises, people sort of the culture has developed a kind of resilience in response to those challenges.
But is it also that it's more, as you already recalled, more of a sharing community rather than the emphasis on individual success and display of status of
That's
success?
another thing, and that's actually an adjacent thing, which is one I would say is born out of the material necessity, let's say, of needing to be interdependent to make do. But there's another cultural thing that happens in, at least in Uruguay. I don't want to speak for other countries because I didn't spend a significant enough time to say culturally what's going on. But in Uruguay, there is a huge culture of um, nobody is sort of better than anyone else. We're all kind of fellow citizens, and to be selfish at the expense of others is really frowned upon. So I would say like the opposite in the US, we have this sort of libertarian idea, you know, sort of good for you if you get more than me, even if it's at the expense of me, you've gamed the system appropriately. In Uruguay, that sort of thing is very frowned upon. It's like even in school, when my kids went to school, it was like we don't want any child to take up too much space. We want to give everybody a chance to answer in front of the classroom. And a funny cultural moment, my husband played on a basketball league in Uruguay. We grew up in Chicago, big basketball city. And in Chicago, the basketball culture is to sort of get the ball if you can. You always get the ball. If you can shoot and get the ball, you should. And in Uruguay, the culture is pass the ball. Everybody should get a turn to shoot. So it's funny. It's a little microcosm story, but it really was part of the culture there to have this idea that everybody should get a turn, nobody should take any more resources than at the expense of others.
Well, that's a very interesting cultural context. Can you see where it came from? Is it from something in the life in Uruguay that is based on it, and they kept that traditional attitude?
I think, I mean, I would just say it seems to me like most people who have had to make do in any kind of community where you had to have interdependence, you learned it was a socially adaptive thing to not be the selfish one because people will remember that and then in the future they won't be sharing with you sort of thing. And I think there's a kind of equilibrium in small town culture. We were in a town that was under 5,000 people. Everybody knows everybody else. So it was a sort of reputational thing. If you were known as somebody who sort of took more than they gave, you would have a reputation as somebody who, was sort of not contributing in the way that other people were, and not being that solidarity. So over time, there would just be this attitude of like, this is sort of how we do things. This is functional, I would say. And it functioned really well. And I think it's not unique necessarily to Latin America. I think I've seen this kind of thing. I've traveled after graduate school and after college and before graduate school. I've seen this kind of thing, hints of this kind of thing in a lot of places where resources are somewhat scarce relative to the US. Now, if you think about like somewhere in the US or anywhere where it's, super high GDP per capita, a lot of times you can just, I can just buy help. I can just buy the things I need. And I don't really have to rely on the kindness of somebody else to get the things I need. If I need, help with my kids, I don't have to ask a family member. I just hire a nanny, this kind of thing where you just sort of hire all your services out. And because of that hyper consumption of hiring every aspect of life, I can just buy all the things I need. I don't need to share with anyone. You sort of lose those soft skills of interdependence and sort of keeping a mental track. How often am I watching their kids? How often are they watching mine? Am I holding up my end of the bargain? Kind of culture. And David Graeber's written about this kind of thing in some of his books, anthropologies of, these kind of non-monetary exchange cultures, where it's not really all written down in a ledger, but people are sort of keeping mental track, if that makes sense, of how much they're giving and how much they're taking.
So you would call it, it's a kind of time bank. They call here in a structure like that a time bank. You give, and then you can ask something from someone else. It's an organized community center activity. You're saying it is a part of basic Uruguayan society to do that.
Yes. I mean, now I would say, now we lived in the countryside. I think probably in Montevideo, as most places, as they urbanize and as they develop, they lose this. And so to
Okay.
say that everyone in Montevideo is doing some sort of sharing culture, I can't say. I don't really know. I didn't live in Montevideo, but I can imagine in a lot of places, the wealthier they get, the more developed they get, the more urban they get, people get isolated, people lose that. They lose those skills. And I mean, this is old sociology. This is, Durkheim talked about this back in, the industrialization of England, this kind of, hyper individualism, hyper sort of isolation from these interdependent networks that happens with these, with sort of modernization.
Yeah, and I think it's so important not to lose the good. We tend to praise the progress, saying, they've got a higher income, a higher education, a better health service and everything. But but in many cases, it comes at a big cost that they're losing exactly what you're saying, which are so beneficial. And then the question is, can you keep those beneficial ways of doing things and not lose them. I think that combination is something that we're looking for. And maybe what you're saying is, yes, it's there, particularly in rural society,
Mhm,
small towns,
mhm.
but it's not necessarily being maintained in the city.
Yep,
And
and
perhaps,
I would say it doesn't necessarily, I think a lot of people, it doesn't necessarily have to be either or. And I think a lot of people sort of take this tack like, if you criticize hyper development, hyper progress, quote unquote progress, um, for some of those losses that come with it, people think you mean all of it. And it's not necessarily all of it. I think Uruguay is a great example where you can have some of the most wonderful aspects of modernity. I mean, Uruguay is focused on getting fiber optic internet for the whole country. And so it's like, cutting edge where we've got, places even in Silicon Valley who don't have that. So they're focused on, we want to develop and modernize in the way that's best for the people. But then at the same time, just having this sort of staunch, I guess, pride in one's culture and desire to maintain those folkways, I think is really important in that balance, modernization, access to services, access to education, healthcare, but then a sort of pride of place, pride of culture that keeps the culture persisting. It's a really tricky balance, and I don't think many cultures have done it well. Some have. Bhutan comes to mind. But it's a tricky balance, and it's my bigger fear living in the US is, how do you turn back the clock once you've hyper developed and you've lost all of those soft skills and all those ways of negotiating with neighbors? Can you ever go back to that kind of
yeah, I
culture?
think that's very difficult. I think exactly what that's one of the issues that we need to talk about in SCORAI is not to lose what's good, because it's very difficult to get it back again once you've lost it. Can I ask you, in Uruguay, the question, another question which comes up is, and taking you back to food, is the diet.
Mm.
Is Uruguay, like some other South American countries, very meat-based diet?
Yes. Okay. So this is a hot button topic, but I've really come around on this topic during my 7 years in Uruguay. So when I first moved to Uruguay, I was just thinking, it's very important that we plant-based diet, and then I got there and everybody eats meat for every single meal. But then I was also encountering all of these farms, agroecological farms that incorporate animals in this extremely biodiverse and non-destructive way. And so I was having a hard time integrating these two parts of my environmental self. And so what I learned over the years is basically there's this sort of cutting edge approach. I mean, I think it was developed in the 70s, but it's called the Voisin method. But in the US, it's called either regenerative agriculture or rotational grazing. Some people call it the Savory method after Alan Savory. But basically, what a lot of people in Uruguay do who are in our circles, the people we had brought students with on the field school, were they take animals like grazing animals, sheep, goats, cows, and they bunch them together into smaller paddocks like to mimic predation in a natural ecosystem. So naturally you'd have like herds of antelope, and there would be a predator, let's say a wolf, and then they would bunch together, they would eat through this little uh, area, and then they would move on. Well, what that does apparently is it stimulates the root growth. Without getting too in the weeds about it, it's really healthy for the soil. It sequesters carbon. It increases the carrying capacity of that land base. And you leave this little section that they were in to grow back over the course of months. And eventually you do this over the course of years, and the landscape, you can not only grow, have animal agriculture, you can do silvopasture, you can do bees, you can do fruit trees, you can do nuts, you could have a garden separately, you can do chickens, you can like sort of stack animals, like there's this interesting thing that people do where they move the cattle through and then they move chickens through after that, and the chickens eat the flies that land on the manure, and this sort of human stewardship of ecosystems. Obviously, this is not what we mean when we say animal agriculture broadly, which is very destructive, where we're talking about CAFOs, we're talking about huge amounts of runoff, huge problems with that. So I've sort of learned, to kind of be at peace with the Uruguayan meat eating, especially in the context of the way in which they raise the meat, and how cutting edge they are thinking about this. And this is sort of coming around. It's sort of what people say, it's not the cow, it's the how. That's the sort of go-to line with this in the English-speaking regenerative agriculture world. So I've really come around to this sort of it's okay to have, there's a diet that's a sustainable consumption diet that includes meat, but you have to be sourcing in these kinds of operations. They're few and far between. But I also have this sort of somewhat like almost like a anti-colonist perspective, because there have been people like maybe people from the FAO or someone from the UN who come into Uruguay and say, you need to stop raising meat. And it's like, you're going to come from the global north and come tell these people who have lived on this livelihood on the Pampas, it's rangeland. They have been on horseback since, for centuries, and you're going to come in and say you need to change and everything needs to be corn and soybeans, which would be infinitely worse because it's industrial versus agroecological, than the way in which these people historically and traditionally have raised cattle. And so it's a fraught issue, but I learned a lot during my time there about, it's quality. There's a quality difference between, it's not, meat isn't just one thing, if that makes sense.
Okay. Now, what happens though to diet? Is the population keeping to a more traditional diet, as you say, meat for every meal, or is it moving to fast food?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I mean, in Uruguay, there's a little bit of fast food, but at least like basically everywhere outside of Montevideo does not have fast food. It just doesn't have it. And what's crazy, what was interesting for me to see, for example, the local grocery store is an agricultural co-op, and it's sourced as locally as possible. And it's not like sort of like a left progressive new thing. It's an old thing. It's like 150-year-old ag co-op meant to provide a store for the farmers, for the local people to buy their food. And so it was sort of like in the US, you have to go way out of your way to buy local. And there, when you go to the grocery store, everything you're getting is from your neighbors. You see the labels. It's, people who have local farms, and it's, oh, this is La Huerta, strawberries, great. And so that kind of thing, it just really isn't a culture of fast food and convenience. I mean, of course, there are processed foods there that are made in some factories, either in Uruguay or, in the Mercosur region, which is the southern cone. They have a free trade between the countries, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. But, by and large, people cook. People really cook, and among my friends, the people who are doing agroecology, they're really big, like gardeners, vegetables, fruit, fresh food too. So it's not just sort of meat, and potatoes. It's this really interesting, very, very local diet. I mean, there was times at which my friends of ours who we brought the students to visit their farms, they would say, okay, we're slaughtering this cow that we've raised. Everybody's going to take some home. Everybody has chest freezers. And then, the best cuts, we're going to eat them all together, and we're going to harvest, whatever's in the garden at that time of year. We're going to have some tomatoes in a salad, or cucumbers, or, a big green leafy salad, and this kind of thing. And, really nice, I would say, at least in my region, in the rural region. Who knows what's going on in Montevideo?
So the population is also has a strong community activity there. Do they
Yep.
get together? Is it based on religious affiliation, or is it based on cultural traditions, or is it just kind of spontaneous or family, or what is it? What brings
Yeah,
people
I mean,
together?
to be honest, Uruguay is a really interesting case because they took out all references to religion early on in their national government. However, like most of Latin America, a lot of those religious, the holidays, for example, they say like Christmas is the day of the family, but everybody kind of knows it's Christmas, and so anyone who celebrates Christmas still celebrates Christmas. But it's pretty secular, but with a sort of such an underlying shared cultural norms. And I would say what brings people together on a practical level, at least in the rural area I grew up in, spent 7 years in, is is connection to place. So a lot of these people, for example, they have small farms. Even if they have other jobs, they have small farms on the side, either, like you might think of an allotment type system. And then people find the other people who have those kinds of farms. This is so funny because this is exactly what I found in my dissertation research as well in Chicago. You find other people who have farms because you either exchange knowledge or exchange tools or exchange goods, and you're looking for places for distribution and sharing information about that. It's sort of like there's this sociological concept, the strength of weak ties. You've got all these weak ties. You say, oh, where are you selling? Oh, can you pick up my produce on the way when you go? Or these kinds of little connections. And then eventually it becomes this point of, oh, okay, well, we're slaughtering a cow. I know you guys will buy some, we'll buy some. And so all these families come, everybody helps process, and it's sort of like a natural way of life. But I think fundamentally it starts from what we talked about before, this need, the interdependence born out of, I don't have the money to buy all my tools independently. I don't have the time to bring my produce to the store every single time I go. So we're gonna share, we're gonna have these connections, and it's really it's geographic and cultural. I mean, I have
And it
this
means that big cooperatives, big businesses have
mhm.
not come in and taken over. It is what you're describing is small scale business that is surviving, is continuing, and is not being taken over by major, even international, but national or big scale producers. This is each person in a small scale. Is that deliberately encouraged by a government policy?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a tricky question because I would say a couple of things. First of all, of course, the people that I associated with are these agroecological farmers, the people I was, who became friends with. And, I would say one thing that happens a little bit with people in an international context, sometimes you'll think like, oh, they're not as cosmopolitan as me. These people were so cosmopolitan and so educated, and it was total, not only peers, but way ahead of me on thinking about a lot of environmental things. So that was really cool to see. But parallel, there is a group in Uruguay who are increasingly John Deere, Monsanto, corn, and soybean. And there's similar kind of, same thing as we have just outside of the city of Chicago, grain elevators and, huge truckfuls of soybeans going to international markets. I would say there's probably right-leaning, or let's just say like neoliberal leaning leadership in Uruguay that is interested in this kind of like quote unquote development toward a more, profitable, again in quotes, way of doing agriculture. But then I would say most of the left-leaning and even the center and center-right have a real pride in Uruguayan culture, which is very much this gaucho ranching culture. And for example, when people like from the UN have come in and said things um, against animal agriculture, even in this case when it's done traditionally and done well, there's a big pushback in Uruguay from that. And so I think part of it is this kind of agroecological or regenerative animal agriculture. If there's a pride in it, a cultural pride, that has sort of resisted on all levels, not just from the people, but the leadership too. And it's a small country with a really strong sense of identity. You know, I would say it's a there's not a lot of varying geography. Like in the US, you've got your mountain people and your city people and the plains in the South. In Uruguay, you've got a kind of unified culture, this sort of rolling plains, horseback, you know, cattle rancher culture. And so there is, you know, there is some resistance, I would say, to industrializing, to centralizing, to turning everything into corn and soybeans in a country that wasn't really necessarily a land that was meant for arable agriculture, but more, you know, ranching agriculture.
And it's a very interesting case compared to, let's say, some other parts of South America which have been lost to massive soybean or industrialized agriculture.
Yep.
Do you see it carrying on like that, or is the aspirations to American lifestyle coming in, and we'll lose that
Yes, I mean, I
beauty?
think that those aspirations are everywhere in the whole world. I think people in general don't really know the bargain they're taking sometimes when they take these, you know, super high consumption, or their goal is this sort of super high consumption lifestyle. My travels around the world, I've talked to a lot of people who've migrated for work. I remember talking to this Nicaraguan guy in Costa Rica who moved for work away from his family. And I said, "Oh, where are you from?" And he said, "Nicaragua." I said, "Oh, why are you here?" "I'm working here in a factory because I can make more money here." He said, and he was started to talk to me about his home place. "Oh, it's so beautiful. It's paradise. You know, it's the Garden of Eden. There's waterfalls, and I know all my family is there." And I'm just thinking in my head, like, why did you leave? It's just, I know, but you have these economic incentives that people follow, and they think like, you know, it's my responsibility to get some wealth for my family. And anyways, I don't really know what will happen in Uruguay. I think I'm sort of the opinion that we're reaching some material limits on a global scale, whether it's like a fertilizer crisis or ammonia or, you know, even the cost of energy, that will force some of this hyper industrialization, hyper urbanization to slow or adapt, and or maybe not develop. And so um, I'm almost like we're in a historical period. If people hold on long enough, they might not get turned all the way over to, you know, not knowing their neighbors and everything's industrial and everyone lives in the city. But we'll just see. I mean, some places have been more successful than others. I think about New Zealand, I think about Bhutan, I think about these places that have like a sort of strong land-based culture, and just a sort of strong culture that can't necessarily be taken over by, you know, let's say the Nikes of the world. And so we'll see. I mean, one can hope. And if any indication of my time there is right, I mean, people have a very good quality of life. They got both the best parts of the modern, you know, education system, healthcare system, access to the internet. I mean, they gave all the kids in, I think, a second or fourth grade laptops so they can learn from the internet, so they get access to the whole world. While at the same time, some of those kids arrive to school on horseback, you know, so it's like this really cool, interesting juxtaposition of, you can indeed get some of the better parts of development and modernity while also maintaining this sort of traditional sustainable consumption, that really leads to a high quality of life, a lot of meaning, a lot of connection to neighbors. You know, it's enjoyable to grow food. It's and everybody has chickens in their yard. It's adorable to have little chickens running underfoot when your little kids pick them up and have that as a part of their life. So
Yeah, I'm not sure if somebody in Hong Kong could say that's possible for us.
no, no, not at all. I mean, and that's the thing. So some things are just geographically impossible, especially
Yeah,
now that we've so hyper urbanized. Although I will say that I've taken some of my insights, both from my dissertation research and time in Uruguay, and have done a little mini bits of growing food here in Chicago just to show it's possible. And a lot of my neighbors are into it. I mean, I've got tons of neighbors with chickens and fruit trees and, beautiful flower gardens and the sort of like even in the city, you can do little amounts of that, and
yeah,
it's enjoyable. Gardening is a hobby for a reason. It's lovely.
yeah.
It only becomes very unpleasant if you're reliant on it and you're out there in the field picking weeds by hand. But little bits of it as a supplement, like most of my neighbors in Uruguay did, is very enjoyable.
So coming to drawing a very interesting conversation towards the end, what would you like to put on the agenda for SCORAI to discuss? What do you think is important? And you can bring in from sharing and equality and so on in Uruguayan life, and you can bring in also from your life in the US and what's right, what's wrong. But what would you like to see um, that we discuss more in SCORAI than we have so far discussed?
One thing I haven't discussed much in this interview, but something that's really been on my mind a lot with not just SCORAI, but sort of environmental thinking more broadly. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I like to talk to people about their stories and then draw connections and draw conclusions from that. And I think to some extent, in a lot of environmental thinking, we don't couch the data, the quantitative global data, in stories enough. And by that, I mean, sometimes, for example, the UN FAO coming to Uruguay and telling them, based on our global data, you need to change your life. You need to change the way you live, even though, in my opinion, the way that they live is very sustainable and something the world should be looking toward. So one of those things I think we need to do is we need to temper some of the conclusions we draw from this global data, like as if everybody in the entire world should be exactly the same, no matter their geography or rainfall or culture or diet or anything, and instead look to a diversity of livelihoods, a diversity of sustainable consumptions. There are different ways to consume sustainably, to have a sustainable lifestyle, whether you're in the city of Chicago, in the middle of an urban environment, in Hong Kong, in Uruguay, in New Zealand, in Brazil. It's gonna look different, and that's okay. And the stories can supplement the data, and they can supplement the hard science too. I mean, let's get some soil scientists out there confirming the fact that we're actually sequestering carbon in these rotational grazing systems in Uruguay. Let's bring in all these different data points. But the one point I would make is, and I say this till I'm blue in the face, there is so much good sustainable consumption happening out there, but a lot of times the researchers who can only see through the lens of a survey instrument they developed and they gave to, people from nations all around the world are missing some of those little sustainabilities that if you sort of hook onto them, you realize they're sort of win-win-win. I mean, people love gardening. Gardening has them meet their neighbors. They're also stewarding the landscape. They're also producing some food. There's these little ways in which, I think people around the world are already doing sustainable consumption, and they were not paying very close attention to them, or not paying the right kind of attention to them, I would say.
That's a great point, and we would like to pick them up. And we're trying to get a new working group together now, which will say, where are there examples around the world in countries, in cities, or where can we look to for getting the examples of more sustainable lifestyles? So Ashley, I would encourage you to put that on the agenda to ask people to come in and say, where are the more sustainable lifestyles and what can we learn from them? That's a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Yep.
And Uruguay sounds a fantastic place.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I can't wait to get back and visit.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.